think that there are many different ways that you can create stories. But you can use conventions that are visual, that bring you back to the earlier tradition. You can also use the conventions to upend and question traditions. You also can create these works in the contemporary setting that actually bring you back to some sensibilities that are part of you, negative as well as positive.
I'm delighted to introduce you to this evening's speaker. Dr. Vishaka Desai is the Special Advisor for Global Affairs to the President of Columbia University and Professor of Professional Practice at the School of International and Public Affairs.
I begin with the image that is in fact here, which is also on the cover of the one and only painting catalog of the Worcester collection that was done in, I think, 79 or 80 or something like that. And the reason I want to begin with this is that I think this picture, in the talk that I want to give, work with you on and discuss with you, which has to do with the narrative traditions of India, is that while you look at a singular figure like this, it actually evokes many, many, many more layers. And it's those layers that we're going to unpack this evening in the short 1 hour that we have together. And I also want to do that not only because it's a beautiful picture and pictures like this that come from all the way from the 16th through the 19th century, the court paintings of India, that this is paramount in that tradition. But I want to do this with you along with some of the select contemporary works in the Worcester collection, is to really kind of think about why is it that the narrative tradition in India persists the way they do. And what is it about the figurative tradition that actually enhances and is central to the idea of telling stories? So when we think about stories and the narrative tradition, it is very clear that this is very human. Susan Sontag once says that we tell stories to make sense of our lives. We create narratives collectively to reinforce the conventions, the kind of practices, the kind of emotions, the kind of aspirations that we as a society have. And all of these are very human, very common. Narrative tradition has been part of art tradition for a very long time. However, it is fair to say that in India, even in the 20th century with the rise of modernism and then contemporary, where narrative tradition in the West really takes a back seat, and it no longer remains as important as we all know. If you look at the Impressionist pictures, if you look at Gauguin, if you look at Picasso, it is not the narrative that drives them. But in Indian tradition, even in the 20th century, there is something about the figurative and the narrative that is persistent. So partly what we want to do is to ask ourselves, why and how does that happen? I am less interested, I should say, in telling you all the specifics of the stories. Because if I did that, you'll be here for 4 hours, and we don't have that time. So I'm going to give you just a synoptic view of some of the highlights, but really to really have you look at these pictures in terms of how the images come together, what kind of stories they tell, and when they trigger the stories that have been part of multiple generations. So I think it's, when we talk about this idea of stories, a number of authors have written wonderful things about telling stories, where Peter Brooks, the great performing theater artist, has said that all human beings bathe in a fundamental narrative ambience. Narratives are what cultures and individuals create to endow experience, the human experience, with meaning. So we create meaning from these stories and make some sense out of our lives. Collectively, in India, it's also about telling stories that make sense of the universe. So it's not just the personal experience, it's not just the experience on this earth, it's also the experience that relates the human beings to the divine, human beings to nature. It's that relational sense of cosmic meaning that is also part of these stories. One of the reasons why I believe this kind of stories persist, we'll come back to this picture later on in the talk, which is really about Krishna bathing in the moonlight in the river Yamuna. You can tell the moonlight, of course, is very obvious. From the moon in the top to the reflection of the moon right below is the slightly yellow garment of Krishna, the dark skinned one with the other women. We'll come back to this picture afterwards. But when we look at stories like this is from a late 18th century picture. It's very clear that certain stories seem to have a persistent presence, and other stories wash away, go away. So what is that? Why does that happen? The other thing is that stories in India get told and told again and again. It has something to do with the oral tradition, not just the written word, but the performative part of a story that actually stays with you a lot longer. We know today, even from the scientific discoveries and studies, that when you hear something, in addition to reading something, you remember it more. So the combination of the oral and the verbal and the written and the visual is why these stories also have a lot of resonance within the culture. I think that the other reason why you come with stories is that stories get depicted not just in one way, but in multiple ways. And as a result, they come back to the ideas of the stories in a multiple formats that also makes it possible. So what we're going to do is to look at some specific examples using the Worcester Museum collection also from the 15th century all the way into the 19th century. And it so happens that one of the reasons I also used to come to Worcester, but that also Worcester Museum is very, I think, proud to have significant small collection of Indian modern and contemporary artists. And that had to do with Chester and Davida Hurwitz. Some of you will remember them because they were really quite the players in Worcester art scene. Majority of their collection has gone now to the Peabody Essex in Salem, but there is a significant collection of that I want to also bring into this conversation. So let's begin with the beginning. And this actually is from the Worcester collection. And this is a 15th century one single page manuscript that is a part of the Jain tradition, one of the big, strong religions of India, contemporaneously founded along with Buddhism in the 5th century BCE. What you see here is very clearly a story that is, Kalakacharya Katha is a very famous story in the Jain manuscript tradition. And these kinds of things were being painted as early as in the 14th century, initially based on the palm leaf manuscripts that come from the 12th century. But suffice it to say that when you look at images like this in the narrative form, it's very clear that the images are fairly generalized. The stories have lots of details about who is that kind of priestly figure going to the prince to ask for pardon of one of his disciples. All of that story is told on the side. The image is just simply to give you a basic idea that the story is about Kalakacharya, the great priest, and him meeting the prince. Gradually, what happens in the later part of the 15th century is you'll begin to see that the images become bigger, text becomes smaller, but the horizontal tradition that comes from the indigenous kind of traditions of palm leaf, as I said before, continues for a while, both in Jain manuscripts as well as in the Hindu manuscripts. So this page is in Detroit. There's something similar to that here as well. It's called Balagopala Stuti. That's about Krishna as a child. Krishna is one of the Hindu gods, and we'll have more to talk about him later on. The breakout in this kind of visualization occurs somewhere around circa 1500. So we're talking about very early 16th century. And when I say a breakout, this is actually, while there's a horizontal picture, most of these, by the way, are part of manuscripts. So there are single folios, but this collection of 100 pages, 200 pages. So when we look at them in a museum context, singular work, they're dismembered from the whole story that's being told. So it's important to remember even the individual pictures you see here, most of them, except for, of course, the modern and contemporary, they were part of much larger books, not sewn together always, but loose folios kept together. So this work, which is called, I love this manuscript because it's called 50 Verses of a Love Thief. The text, written in the 12th century by a great Kashmiri poet, Bilhana, and then painted it probably somewhere in northwestern part of India. We don't know quite where, but what you see, the poet himself, Bilhana, as you see up top, who is in love with the lady Champavati, who he is coming to be with, of course, in her bedchamber. And this particular idea that you have a simple text up top, 2 lines, the entire image is about this big, is given now over to the energy of these 2 figures to give you a sense of that impending love union, which ultimately results in him being imprisoned because she's a princess and he's a mere poet. And that idea is really suggested here with the angularity of the clothing you see, the big eyes, where they are just ready to go into that bedchamber. Is that the reason why I call this a breakout picture? This whole collection actually is in my hometown in India, in Ahmedabad. Great, great manuscript. And it's a breakout picture because of the idea of using figures in a paramount way, no longer subservient to the text. It is about the picture. It is not just, it is trying to depict up top. And that idea continues to be active in the 16th century throughout different parts of northern India. Most of the paintings you see here are from north and northwestern part of India. This kind of miniature painting tradition didn't exist in the south for a variety of complicated circumstances. In any case, so what you see here is another one of this Krishna bathing, like the early picture that I showed you. This too is about moonlight, hence this kind of light blue color, and Krishna, the dark blue god, is very clear, with the attendant gopis, as they're called, in the river, very different kind of conception. But in these early phases, you also have very flattened kind of manuscript. There's almost no depiction of space, no depiction of movement from one place to another. It is simply a frontal, almost like a wall painting that you might encounter. And the idea of larger images and small text, or images getting more and more paramount, is also true in other kind of manuscripts. So you have heard about Jain, you heard about a Hindu manuscript. This is a Persian manuscript, but commissioned 1501 in central India in a Muslim court that also was very active. The style here, and this is actually the book of recipes. So those of us who are foodies, and it's very interesting to try to figure out exactly what they're cooking. But the reality is that here, on the one hand, the vertical manuscript is different. So we've talked about horizontal. Now you're looking at the books that come out of the tradition from the Persian courts. And Iran and India have very strong connections for a long period of time, but particularly in the 14th, 15th, and ultimately in the 16th century. So what you see here, it's called Nimat Nama, and it has to do with the ruler, who is a connoisseur of food, is a foodie, the ultimate foodie. And he is actually commissioning different kinds of recipes from all different parts of India, not just from Iran. So while he himself, his heritage is from Iran, he is now establishing himself in the subcontinent. And what you see here stylistically is a combination of both Persian styles of male dressers, but female, as you see on the other side. You'll see the woman with this kind of, again, pointed clothing and the coverage of her scarf, which she's right next to the man who is standing, giving the food to the Sultan. These kinds of conventions come out of the indigenous tradition. So what you're beginning to see is in the narrative format and in the visual format, various styles beginning to come in a different way to create a new picture, which is really what India is about. It's about this melange of styles, connections, and cultures coming together. And there, the real transformation occurs in the mid-16th century. And you, at the Worcester Museum, you have a fantastic page. This is a page really commissioned by the great Mughal Emperor Akbar. It is a page from Jami al-Tawarik. What happens here in terms of what happens with the narrative tradition is that this is a large volume commissioned by Mughal Emperor Akbar, who comes to the throne in 1556. And he commissions a manuscript to depict his genealogy, going all the way back to Genghis Khan, because he claims his maternal heritage from Genghis Khan. His paternal side is a small Central Asian Fergana province that now is in Afghanistan, and he's actually a petty ruler, his family's. So by creating this manuscript, he is aggrandizing his genealogy to say he comes from a very good pedigree. And this particular piece is actually a story of one of the great Mongol rulers, and his name is Ghazan Khan. It is his birth when he is born. So if you start from the top, and you will see that this is something very different from what you've seen before, right? So you begin to have this continuous narrative. You begin to have almost a vertical theatrical settings where there is one section down below, another section up there, a third one diagonally on the other side, and then the pièce de résistance, which is the birth of this great ruler up top, where the child is being shown by the wet nurse to the mother as he is born, and the text is very minimal. 2 lines up top, 2 lines there, and then followed by multiple pages that probably would describe in detail what the birth was. But the 2 lines that you see top and the bottom simply tell you that the wet nurse shows the child to the mother, and on this auspicious day, this great ruler is born, when the horoscope men are really checking out the stars and creating the horoscope, because you know this is a significant ruler. The lower part of the picture is simply something you would do for any birth scene in an important family. So the artists have certain amount of freedom. What they've done in this bottom section, food is coming in, a small swing for the child, a cradle is coming in. People are bringing gifts, and that is all going into mainly to the zanana, where ultimately it will be controlled by the lady over here. The horoscope men are doing their job over there, and then out here into the street outside of the main court are musicians. All of these are scenes that you would have found in India. It is not about 13th century when Ghazan Khan was born. This is all about making this completely current in the Indian context. So what's happening here with the story is that the narrative is as much about a purpose, what the royal figure, Akbar, wants to do, but it's also about grounding it in the reality, which is a new reality for the Mughal king in the 16th century. And it is in the Mughal period that you begin to really have a melange of styles coming together that cohere into something called a Mughal style. This style has as much to do with Chinese landscape traditions that are coming via Tibet in terms of the kind of mountains that you see up top, but you will also see in the corner, all the way up in the very top corner, little units that are almost like Northern Renaissance pictures. These are the little Western things that are coming into India at the time via Bibles, prints that are coming in. And what's interesting is that if this Western stuff is coming in via Christianity and Jesuits, Indian things are going out, and we know that about the same time, in fact, in the 17th century, Rembrandt is looking at Mughal paintings to copy them to make it into figures. So when we talk about interconnectivity, all of these kinds of styles tell us something about how the world has continued to move back and forth. Is not a new phenomenon. As much as some of us might want to build a wall, it's not possible. Not to get political, I'm sorry. But the reality is that that kind of an idea at the Mughal court is not just about his personal story. It's not even just about Muslim stories. Akbar also commissions big translations of the great Indian text of Mahabharata, Ramayana, Harivansha, which is the genealogy of the Krishna stories, and Vishnu. And this particular painting is a fantastic painting from the Metropolitan Museum of Krishna holding the Mount Govardhana on his head, as you see right over here, a very, very important part of the story of Krishna. And you see that the mountains are not Indian mountains. These are mountains that have come up from the visual style of the Chinese painting tradition, mediated via the Mongol pictures from Persia into India, as well as some Tibetan connection. So the point I'm trying to make is that stylistically, as well as narratively speaking, in the Mughal court, you have many, many different ideas are coming in together to create something that becomes this kind of synthetic Indian tradition that is as much a part of India, and it is possible in India because of the flexibility of India that is a part of the Indic cultural tradition. And it is in this milieu that you also see for the first time, and perhaps the only time, when you begin to have something close to the Western figurative tradition of portraiture. And a portraiture which is very specific of people, of instances, occasions when people would be seen. This particular work, which is also in the Boston Museum collection, is the Darbar of Jahangir, dating from about 1620, early 17th century. So it's Akbar's son that you're now part of. And what you have here is Jahangir Parvez, who comes after one of the big battles that he has just fought. And ultimately, after this picture, he is no longer in favor because the other son, who is standing next to that small young child, Shah Jahan, becomes much more popular. The reason why I wanted to show you this is that I think this exception of having individualized portraits, and in this case, every single name is written in the little turbans, so you know exactly who they are. And on the basis of who they are and what they look like, although they are actually, the faces are done from traces of portraits and put in here. In other words, the artist didn't actually sat there and copied everybody when they were sitting there. He just knew where they were. He had their samples and the faces, and he attached them onto the figures. But the reality is that it was important to know who they are. And here, one thing that I should say is that for a long time, historians talked a lot about the fact that Mughal court was so open and Jesuits had undue influence. They had so much influence that people thought that Jahangir or Akbar might even become Christians. And I just look at this picture and I say, okay, so where is that Jesuit priest? You see him with the black hat down below? Okay, so he is standing next to the man who is the head of stables. Not so important. All the important guys are over there, not here. And that tells you something that, yes, he was interested The emperors were interested in learning about lots of things, but they were not so easily movable to just say, okay, I'm going to just completely become something else. And so all of these are ways of understanding hierarchy, understanding ways of the story. So this actually also comes from the story of Jahangir's life that he had gotten written and then depicted in his lifetime. So each one of these pictures also tell us something about the context, who is important, who is not, how they actually thought about the stories, what was worth depicting, and all of these would have been decided by the chief librarian and the chronicler of the Mughal court, and then work with the painters. So the portraiture tradition really begins in a way with the Mughal tradition of this 16th and the early 17th century. You have some amazing portraits like this, which is of a great saint. This is actually the portrait of Man Singh of Amber, a Hindu ruler, one of the first Hindu Raja or ruler to serve at the Mughal court in the late 16th century, and who also gives his daughter in marriage to Akbar. Very unusual, very rare, and probably one of the few times that such a thing had happened at the royal level, for which he got a certain amount of scorn, and then other people started doing that as well. So this is also another kind of the Hindu-Muslim relationship that comes through when you see a portrait like this. But there is no portrait more significant, I believe, or poignant or powerful than this small drawing, again in the Museum of Fine Arts collection, Boston, of a young, not a young man, but middle-aged man who served at the court of Jahangir. And he he had just been 2 weeks before this portrait was taken, he was promoted to being the paymaster general of the Special Corps of Imperial Servants. And we know a lot about him because Jahangir writes in his diary what happened. And he says, on this day, news came of the death of Inayat Khan. And then he goes on to describe the appearance and condition of this man in great detail. And he says, some days before this, he had petitioned that he might go to Agra. I asked them to bring him to me so he could get the permission in person. And then he goes on to say, they put him in a palanquin and brought him. He appeared so low and weak that I was astonished. He was skin drawn over bones, or rather, his bones too had dissolved. Though painters have striven much in drawing an emaciated face, I have never seen anything like this, nor anything even approaching to this. Good God, can a son of man come to such shape and fashion? As it was a very extraordinary case, I directed painters to take his portrait. That very moment, meaning Jahangir is somewhere, painters are there, he asked them to paint this portrait. Next day, he traveled the road of non-existence. Now you might say, for the emperor, why is he so taken with this man? This man was an opium addict and had trouble with alcohol. So did the emperor. And we know that later on in his life, this is about, we're not sure, 1610, by 1620, Jahangir is so addled that he's not able to function, and it is his wife who actually takes care of the business. So you know that there is something very personal about seeing this, and somewhere feeling like, oh my God, would this happen to me as well? But the reality is that this kind of portraiture is not seen again in India. It's an exception. It's one of those things that you just say, It's an artist, it's the patron, and it's a subject matter. And those three things come together and it makes something so special. There is a finished painting of this in the Bodleian Library in Chesterbeatty Collection in Ireland. And because the pillows are all kind of orange and bright colors, it isn't the same. There's the immediacy of this picture that is completely different from what you would usually find in Indian painting. However, it is fair to say that the portraiture idea does get picked up. It may not have the same level of specificity or observation of details of personality, but the idea of portraiture for creating a royal scene or a royal darbar also goes to the Hindu courts in other parts of northern India, especially in Rajasthan. So the darbar that I just showed you like this, that actually gives some voice to other kinds of darbars, as you see with this very fine painting from the court of Mewar or Udaipur. If you have ever been there, this is about early 18th century, about 100 years after the pictures you saw elsewhere. And you will immediately see that the number of things are different. First and foremost, obviously this is Holi, the spring celebration, and it is the formal darbar on the occasion of playing Holi, or the spring festival where you throw colors at each other. And the second thing you will also notice is the hierarchy is determined very differently. You no longer have that kind of vertical thing of closest person being at the top. You actually, in this case, we also know from the back, although names are not at the top, full inscription tells you exactly who is in attendance. And from that we know that actually some of the most important figure, of course, is the central figure, Ari Singh, with a little nimbus in white right underneath the kind of the tent-like setting that you see there in the Shamiana. And then the rest of the figures are all the way around, but it's much more in a circular or square fashion. And the most important people are at the axial positions, not just necessarily who is closest to the king. So there is a very different sense of order and a different sense of power within the Hindu courts of Rajasthan than what you see in the Mughal court. But Mughal court has certain level of permutations, observation details, some sense of specificity of history. All of this is something that permeates within the Indian tradition on top of the literary and the religious and the other kind of manuscript traditions that go on. And so when you see singular figures, I just wanted to kind of finish out this singular figure idea and the portraiture idea to say that the portraiture can be seen in a number of different ways. In this case, this too is a celebration of Vasanta Panchami, or the spring festival, for the worship of Krishna, but the portraiture you see on the side looks very stylized, but it's actually a specific person, a specific ruler who acts as a temple priest on this day of this particular festival, and therefore you'll begin to have the idea of mechanism by which you bring religious ideas and secular ideas together, where the roles get changed. And that idea of melding of religious and secular, literary, poetic, and religious is something that is a very, very typical part of the Indian narrative tradition. So when you see a singular figure like this, in this case, not at all a portrait, a particular kind of a woman, not unlike the first image I showed you. So within the Indian literary tradition, when you see an image like this, immediately it triggers certain kind of ideas and images. And that has to do with a single woman with a hand on her chin, looking at a tree in this yellowish background that immediately would suggest a woman on her way to meet her lover, but in the heat of the day. That is quite different from that kind of dark, stormy night that we saw in the first picture. And it has as much to do partly with style, but also with the connotation. Now you will see that the text is simply just a reference up top. The full text is in the back, and the full text is in Sanskrit, whereas the top things are written in what we call Takri, which is one of the smaller vernacular languages in Punjab Hills, which is where the picture comes from. And what that tells you is that you have great manuscripts written in Sanskrit dating from 11th, 12th, 13th century. By this early 18th century, people probably don't know the Sanskrit text, but they've heard it. They can't read it. The painter definitely doesn't know how to read it. So somebody has told the painter, this is the picture of the Abhisarika Naika. So he knows, okay, how to do that. You put that in, and then somebody else puts it together with saying, this is what that text is about. So the image is really intended to evoke the full text without you necessarily knowing what the full text is. You know the essence of the text, not necessarily the full literary meaning of the text. And so when I think of this work, this is in fact in your collection here by Lakshma Ghosh, and that idea of a single woman looking somewhere, getting ready to get up, immediately within an Indian context, it has that notion of the Naika, or the archetypal heroine, a lover, going somewhere, getting ready, waiting, awaiting. So all of those literary allusions get fed into looking at a picture that's very casual, actually. But the twist of the head, the way she's sitting, maybe it's those of us who are historians, but immediately it has that notion of this is not just a woman at a particular moment that the artist has observed. There is other layers that get fed into that. As is true of this very lovely sketch also in the collection here, a woman getting dressed. We might say, gee, it's just somebody in the morning waking up, putting her hair up, and putting some makeup on. In India, there is such a long tradition of a woman getting dressed to meet her lover, to be ready. And all of that goes back to the Krishna-Radha romance that we will now pay attention to a little bit more. And therefore, this very suggestion immediately has other connotations. And those connotations help you understand and keep the idea of early stories alive even in a contemporary setting. I don't mean to imply that all contemporary artists do this, and I don't mean to imply that this is the only way to look at contemporary art, but it's important to understand that there is a strand that continues in a very powerful way, not just in paintings, but even in Bollywood films. The amount of romance and love and anguished love, love in separation, love in anticipation is very strong in the Indian literary and religious tradition. So there is something about some of these ideas that permeate even our modern culture. So when you see a woman like this then, Vaikuntan, again, this is in the collection here, a South Indian artist. This is a small work, but he's also done some bigger things. And you can see that he's trying to do the anti-archetypal heroine or a lover. He's trying to actually very intentionally try to break out of that mold of idealization of a female body or a female figure, and at the same time, abstraction from the portraiture also becomes a very important part of what he does, which is very much more typical within the Indian context. And so this idea of triggering mechanism, or putting something that also says something more than what it just is there, is true of a number of contemporary artists. So here, this work, which originally was also in the Hurwitz collection, and it is by a very well-known painter, Atul Dodia, and this is this idea of portrait of Gandhi. How do we know it's a portrait? It's a portrait because immediately it has to do with the iconography of Gandhi, having the stick, about to walk, and somebody is putting a garland on it with this very big long crane. And this is for Atul, there's a very specific context to this picture. This is called October 2nd, 1993. October 2nd is Gandhi's birthday. 1993 is the huge Hindu-Muslim riots that occurred in Bombay. And that idea of, is Gandhi's spirit alive? What is happening to what he promoted versus what happened in his city, Bombay, at the time? And therefore, that kind of breaking of the background, or not even seeing who is doing the garlanding with that kind of a big crane, and then having that very modern facility in the back, all of this then raised other kind of triggering mechanism, which is no longer just about portrait of a person, but other ways to look at that portrait. So one of the things I would suggest is that in India, even in modern and contemporary works, when people look at figurative tradition, portraiture, there is some lack of insistence on specificity, like you saw in Inayat Khan, that is quite common. So this work also in the Worcester collection by Jayashree, very fine female artist, there is this kind of abstracted face, putting other things around, a seated figure that actually doesn't tell you much about a person, even though she intends it to be a portrait. And the portraiture comes in more because of the clothing rather than the facial features. And so now I want to shift away from the figurative and the portraiture to back to the narrative. And what I'd like to suggest here is that we really think about this narrative tradition that has much more to do with two great epics and stories, one that deal with Krishna and the other that deal with Rama. And the third is really, Krishna is also part of the Mahabharata, the big story. So these are like Iliad and Odysseys, big stories, big ways written. We don't even know the exact dates, probably somewhere in some of them are 4th century BCE, and then they get revived again and again and again, as much as in the 17th century there is a new version of the Ramayana that somebody writes with a new interpretation. And even today, the recitation of Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavad Purana are a very big part of the Indian psyche and also the cultural establishment. Ramayana is obviously one of those big stories. This particular piece comes from the Boston Museum, where there is a huge collection of both drawings and paintings. And this is one of those few pictures and the sets that tell us that they're big. These are big, much bigger than usual miniature paintings. And they have a text, 2 lines in Sanskrit in the back, and then in the vernacular right below, and big enough language that actually has been suggested that probably these were pictures held for the courtiers and recited from the back. So you would hear, look at the picture, and think of the words. So that notion of the oral tradition related to the painting like this becomes much, much clearer to us. Here, the story is, in a nutshell, you have Ravana, the evil king of Sri Lanka, if you will, in his golden palace, who has abducted the wife of Rama, Sita, and he has created an army of bears and monkeys, and the great monkey Hanuman, who is his main attendant, has gone off to Sri Lanka to try to find A, identify where Sita is, and B, then to try to get her back, and C, burn the palace. So what is happening here is a very different composition from what we saw in the Mughal pictures of the Jami al-Tawarik, where there is a much more vertical movement going upward. Now what you see is a really sequential story, but much more horizontal, with some diagonal movement, the depth that comes out of the Mughal painting tradition. But by and large, you really begin to go back to the more flattening of the surface and the story that just gives you basic lines, but within that whole picture, you can tell exactly what's going on. And most Indians would immediately get it because the story is very alive. Everybody would know, and if you were in the olden days, you could recite it also. It may be a recitation in your own language, maybe not in Sanskrit, but you would know it. And that idea of triggering of just enough stuff that everybody knows is also true of this Krishna bathing in the water, Krishna stealing clothes. This particular picture also in your collection is early to mid 20th century from Odisha, from eastern India. Now, the idea of the oral tradition with the visuals is very alive in Odisha even today. So much so that, so it's a piece like this, which is from the Gita Govinda, another great Krishna story. It's called the Love Song of the Dark Lord, where everybody would know these songs and they would recite it while they look at this picture. So much so that you would love this. When Titanic came to India, the movie, and it was the first little movie theater in this village where these pictures were being done. People went to see it and immediately they said, oh, so we'll do this. So they started making scrolls. And they made a scroll of Titanic with Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio right on that top of the boat before they fall down. And they made the whole thing and they started singing the song. They made the song. So this idea of seeing something, making it into your own tradition, and what they painted is entirely in the tradition of the Orison painting. So the tradition is made anew, but it persists. It's that idea of looking at something, incorporating that, and putting it into your own world without changing your world entirely is what I think is something rather special within the Indian tradition. And from that early picture, 20th century, one part of India, this is about 1780s, and we come back to this picture that I showed you before. What I find particularly interesting about this series that comes from the court of Kangra in northwestern Punjab Hills, south of Kashmir region, is that on the one hand, it is not as iconic nor as symbolic. It could almost be women swimming at moonlight by a village. There is something very lyrical, poetic, and not very hierarchical in an obvious way, nor very religious. And it has something to do with this 10th chapter of the Bhagavad Purana, which is also very lyrical. It particularly tries to really suggest Krishna as one of us. And Krishna, who is part of this, inviting the women of the villages, playing with them, frolicking with them in the water, and then actually coming back and enjoying that moonlight, and look at that landscape. It just completely fulfills that idea of union, joyousness, and happiness. And then it changes. He disappears. And women are all wondering, where is he? They're looking for footsteps. They're asking the deer, and look at the landscape. Things are beginning to kind of shift. It's almost like the creatures and the creepers are all coming together to create the evoking of the sentiment of Krishna, who is with us, but not with us. And that idea of he's disappeared, people are dejected, the special lady Radha, as you see her separated from the rest of the figures in that very moonlight, she's saying, where is he? Why is he not with me? That longing and that idea of playing but not with you is also thought to be as part of what we would call the bhakti tradition, where the soul longing to be one with God pines and yearns to be connected, and the love between Radha, the human one, And Krishna, the divine one, is as close to the human love as you would get. But it has that other layer that everybody who reads this, looks at this picture, would be aware of. And it is that idea of making the connection with the divine human that also makes these ideas persist and stay strong and alive. So I want to show you quickly some of these pictures of how that works, that kind of duality that becomes one, hierarchy that is cut away from hierarchy is part of the Krishna Radha story. So in this case, again, the Nayika, the Radha who is sitting here, is being asked by her attendant to go and meet Krishna, and she says, why should I do that? He's with all those other women. And you have that idea of resistance that's part of this picture. But the longing is not always just one-sided. It's not just a longing of Radha. You also have longing of Krishna. And this is a forbidden love, in that Radha was supposed to be a married woman. So when Krishna is trying to come and meet her in a picture like this, he actually dresses as a woman to come into the Zanana to meet Radha. And you know that's Krishna because of the dark skin. And that dark skin gives you the symbol as to how you would do it, and he comes in a boat, but actually it is in the private garden where Radha is seated. At the same time, the clothing they wear is entirely of the court traditions of the 18th century. So it is completely grounded in the reality of one's own time, not of some other time, not of some other past. And it is even about Krishna after lovemaking. This is a very fine picture in National Museum in Delhi, and it's also Gita Govinda, where there's a phrase after all of their struggles and troubles of meeting, not meeting, finally they meet, they make love in the forest, and Krishna puts his crown over Radha. So now the grace is upon her from that love, where Radha has become Krishna. So it's Krishna becoming Radha, Radha becoming Krishna. It's that kind of a union that immediately suggests that it is not just about the narrative, it's also about the emotive of that narrative. That would be part of this picture that people who were looking at this, and by the way, these pictures, I should point out, were not meant for everybody. These were for court, for high privileged people. That's where they were, compared to that one picture I showed you from Odisha that's much more common. But there is a layer that connects all of them. And that then continues in the stories, whether there are other stories that also have this kind of longing. This is Sohini and Mahival, another kind of story. Or a ruler of Kishangarh, where he sees himself as Krishna. And we know from the inscription on this picture that this is him, depicting himself as Krishna with his favorite lover, Bani Thani, who then becomes kind of an epitome of this Nayak-Nayika or lover sequence. A general court scene, a courtier sitting in his pavilion, and immediately when you see the women back over there, immediately that reminds you of that other connection of the Krishna-Radha romance. And as a result, when you see this Lakshma Gaud picture, which is also in the Worcester collection, you know, it's very hard not to see it in that frame where there is a woman, and this is called a woman meeting a tree spirit. That tree spirit is also about the connection between nature and human, kind of the Kangra pictures that we saw. But there's also kind of something menacing about that, a little scary, but also as if the woman is kind of startled that this is happening. But it has these other layers of history, layers of association that one can bring to a picture like this to appreciate it in the Indian context. And this is from some of the musical modes that also suggest this idea of a heroine getting dressed, that goes back to the concept that I discussed earlier. And then you have it in the contemporary side, where Hussein, who's some of the very fine prints you have here, that when we see a picture like this, and you'll see it's sort of like arrows and a figure, and he of course calls it Arjuna's arrows, and that refers right back to one of the great epics, Mahabharata. So sometimes it's just a little symbol that can give you the whole story. So when you think of the Arjuna's arrows, it's about Arjuna in that great big epic battle of Mahabharata. You don't need to see everything. As is true of this picture of another kind of chariot that Arjuna was part of, but very anguished. This is a large oil painting, also by Hussein. And this is a particularly fun and an interesting one. This is called Draupadi. Draupadi is I don't want to get into the whole story, but essentially it has to do with the chess playing by her husband, and she's married to 5 men, 5 brothers. And one of the oldest brother, who is a moral but a weak person, Yudhishthir, who plays chess with one of his evil cousins and essentially loses in the chess, and he gives his wife away. And at that point, the clothing of the wife, she says, my honor is being taken, and it is her clothing that's being ripped apart, and it's Krishna who helps her. So Hussein, a great Indian painter of the late 20th century, second half of the 20th century, does that. And for most Indians, the minute you say Draupadi, it would immediately, the whole thing will become clear. And you could then create the whole scene for yourself. It is that idea of shared heritage that becomes a very important part of how we understand the persistence of Indian mythical and other stories. But there are some contemporary artists who very consciously use the concept of tradition, concept of the narrative, for actually upending it. And I want to just give you, I want to end with these 2 different examples. This is by Bhupen Kakkar, a very fine Indian artist, one of the most important artists in the late 20th century again, and mainly late 20th century. He passed away. One of the only openly gay artists in India at the time. And this picture is a watercolor, and it's called Sakhi Bhav. Now, when we hear Sakhi Bhav, for many people coming out of the Bhakti tradition or the religious tradition would immediately say, that's about a male taking on the role of a female for suggesting that devotional love for Krishna. So here, Bhupen, actually in a self-portrait, portrays himself as, by covering the kind of scarf he has, as if he's a female. And immediately that idea of Sakhi Bhav now, in the context that he is a gay artist, begins to have a different connotation. So he's purposely using the tradition to upend the tradition to say something else. And that is also true of the very last set of slides that I'm going to show you now, and that is by Nilima Sheikh, another very fine artist. She's actually in Baroda, where Bhupen was as well, and she and her husband both are very well-known artists. This is a series called When Champa Grew Up. And it is about this young woman who is seen here using the kind of interior settings that you would find in 18th century Punjab Hills painting, like the some that I showed you before. Nilima chooses the very lyrical tradition of the compositions of the early miniature painting tradition to completely question something else. This is one of the only whole series of manuscripts she did, which is like collection of paintings, just like 18th century miniature paintings. And this story is about this young girl, a young woman, who was a daughter of one of the peons at the University of Baroda, where Nilima and her husband teach and have lived. And what you see inside is the mother-in-law. I say no more. But the story was about this young woman who comes in and doesn't have enough dowry. And she's alone at night in the kitchen with that menacing forces that are behind, right on the corner. And what Nilima does is to use these earlier conventions to actually create an emotional valence that's completely contemporary. And ultimately we find out that that young woman was the subject of a dowry death. And she died because of that kerosene stove. And Nilima heard about it only when she saw the ritual mourning of these women. And she said, "What's going on?" And they said, that young girl that Nilima had seen on a swing before she got married was no more. The reason why I wanted to end with this series is that I think that there are many different ways that you can create stories. But you can use conventions that are visual, that bring you back to the earlier tradition. You can also use the conventions to upend and question traditions. You also can create these works in the contemporary setting that actually bring you back to some sensibilities that are part of you, negative as well as positive. Nilima actually did this series and also asked her husband Ghulam Sheikh to find, who speaks Gujarati, to find folk songs that deal with this phenomenon of a woman being killed in a dowry death. And she put them together. So there's another way to create a narrative that comes from different sources. So with this last part, let me just say that the part of the reason to think about how does narrative work and why does it matter is because I believe in India there is a sense of multiplicity of layers and simultaneity of layers that allows the past to remain active without having things move away, which is why often people say Indians live in many centuries at once. In this small presentation, I hope I've given you some flavor of what that means and how it works, where sometimes an image with the one hand, one symbol, can create a whole story, and other times you create new stories based on the old traditions. Thank you.
The other thing I really don't like is when people can smile and not move their eyes, like so their eyes like don't crinkle, and so it's just like they're kind of like, you know, you see a chimpanzee with its teeth like that, and everyone thinks it's cute because it's smiling. That's actually how a chimpanzee shows terrible anger.